For this list, I'm excluding monsters with crazy summoning conditions and focusing more on effects. I'm also excluding win condition cards, as by design, they're supposed to have hard requirements to pull off, because they win you the game instantly. At number 10, we've got Fu Rin Kazan. In order to activate this card, you need to have an Earth, Fire, Wind, and Water monster face up on the field, and then you get to choose one of 4 effects, all of which are good. You basically get to choose to Raigeki your opponent's field, Harpy's Feather Duster their spell and traps, Delinquent Duo their hand, or Pot of Greed and draw 2 cards. This card is a good example of what kind of effect should be attached to a card with ridiculous activation requirements. Although, there is an easy way to meet the requirements of this card. Elemental Mistress Doriado is a level 3 ritual card with the effect of being treated as all attributes besides Dark and Divine, basically. So, with this card out, you can activate Fu Rin Kazan with 1 monster. Also, Elemental Hero Electrum and Invoked Elysium can single-handedly fulfill the conditions for this card as well, only they are both a lot more difficult to bring out than Doriado. At number 9, we've got Berserker Soul. In order to activate Berserker Soul, you must attack directly with a monster with 1500 or less attack. Then, you discard your entire hand, then you excavate a card from the top of your deck, and if it's a monster, you can inflict 500 points of damage and send it to the graveyard, and then you can repeat the effect up to 7 more times until you excavate a non-monster card. Now, what makes the activation requirement for this card difficult is just all of the setup for it. For one, attacking directly with a monster with less than 1500 attack is not very hard, but then you lose your entire hand to activate the card, which is really only a cost that's used with really good card effects, like card destruction. But hey, Berserker Soul does do a potential of 4000 points of effect damage, which is half the life points of a player, and that's not including the monster who attacked directly to activate the effect. But then there's the excavating. In order to realistically pull this off, you'd need to run a monster mash deck, and even then, you'd most likely be running 3 copies of Berserker Soul. So if you excavate one of your other copies of this card, your chain would just be over. So all in all, requires you to perform an action on field, ditch your hand, run a monster mash deck for its full effect potential, and get lucky on top of that. Funny enough, the wording on this card and how it resolves its effect is done in a way that even if you were to bring your opponent's life points to 0, in the middle of this card's effect, it will continue going until you excavate a non-monster. At least until the rulings were changed in 2015, which is supposed to directly reference the anime, in which Yugi used this card's effect over and over again, even after he'd already won the duel. At number 8, we've got Goddess of Sweet Revenge. In order to activate this card, you need to basically control no monsters on the field, or in your hand, and then get attacked by your opponent. Once all these conditions are fulfilled, you can then discard this card to destroy all of your opponent's cards, and special summon any one monster from your deck. If you summon a good enough monster, like say Archlord Christia, to lock your opponent down, this effect can win you the game. But its activation requirements are kinda hard to pull off, as having an empty board in hand is a really hard state to get yourself in intentionally, so you'll most likely be hoping to draw this card as a comeback option, and not really trying to get its conditions set on purpose, unless you're just running a really bad deck. At number 7, we've got Converging Wishes. In order to activate this card, you need 5 Synchro Dragon type monsters in your graveyard with different names. And then you get to special summon a Stardust Dragon, who will then gain attack equal to their attacks and be able to attack multiple monsters per turn. Basically, it's a win condition if you pull off the effect. The problem, of course, is getting 5 Synchro monsters in the graveyard with different names. Doing it the old-fashioned way is too slow, as performing 5 synchro summons with 5 different dragons is tough and not fast enough to actually pull this card off in a meaningful time frame. So the best way to fill the graveyard is to cheat the monsters straight from the extra deck there, with cards like Zaborg the Mega Monarch and Gale Dagra, with Zaborg being the most practical way, as he can send 8 cards from the extra deck to the graveyard and fulfill the conditions for this card very easily by himself. Number 6, Symbol of Friendship. This card is one of those weird ones that requires all kinds of special conditions that are difficult to create on purpose. What you need to activate this card is for your opponent to control at least 3 or more monsters, and for you to have 0. Then you need to draw this card from your deck during your draw phase while these conditions are already in place, and then you can finally activate its effect, which is to simply search out one of any card from your deck. And granted, that is a good effect, but not worth the hoops you have to jump through to get it. And the best way to use this card is to cheat out its effect with Diamond Dude and not even bother trying to use its effect the way it's intended, as it's just too cumbersome. Number 5, the Six Shinobi. In order to activate this card, you need to control 6 face-up 6 samurai monsters with 6 different attributes, aka every single attribute in the game except Divine. This is also the first ever card in the game to require 6 monsters on the field in order to activate its effect, as this wasn't possible until Master Rule 4. And the effect is to skip your opponent's next turn, which, I might add, is a great effect and worth trying to pull off. You'll notice a lot of these hard to activate cards basically have game-winning effects tied to them if you can pull them off. Not all of them, of course, but most of them do. So anyway, the Six Shinobi is actually not the hardest thing in the world to pull off with 6 samurai. The 6 samurai were already all about having different attributes, so there's an abundance of each attribute to fulfill the conditions of getting all 6 out at once. Even the 3 extra deck 6 samurai monsters all have a different attribute. Plus, 6 Sams are all about swarming the field, and they even have an archetype specific card called Backs to the Wall, which lets them special summon as many 6 Sams from the graveyard as possible, with different names, at the cost of setting your life points to 100. All in all, the Six Shinobi has a great effect. It's tough to activate, but not that hard within its own archetype. But also a card you do have to build the deck with in mind. You can't just splash it into a normal 6 samurai deck and expect to be able to use it. At number 4, we've got the Law of the Normal. This card requires you to have 5 level 2 or lower normal monsters on your side of the field to activate, and then both players discard their hands and destroy all cards in the field except level 2 or lower normal monsters. With the more recently released Digitron card, the max attack of level 2 monsters you can get is 7,300 with 3 Digitrons and 2 Pikemans, which is not enough for an OTK. But if you instead use level 1 monsters, you can use Triangle Power first and then Law of the Normal for an OTK, as Triangle Power increases the attack of all level 1 monsters by 2,000 until the end phase, easily giving you over 10,000 points of damage. Now, the biggest problem with Law of the Normal is that the card basically requires your main deck to have a bunch of level 2 or lower normal monsters in it. And level 2 or lower normal monsters are terrible. Low level normal monsters in mass are really bad, and they can't do anything on their own. But luckily, they have a lot of good support to swarm the field, with cards like Tri-White, Treasure Panda, and the League of Uniform Nomenclature. So fulfilling the conditions of this deck is possible, and it's possible to do it quickly. But you do have to build your entire deck around Law of the Normal, as there are no other decks that can innately fulfill the conditions of it, and it's not going to be a good deck. And this is coming from someone who has more Law of the Normal videos on his channel than any other deck. Number 3, Drago Roar. This card requires you to banish 4 monsters from your graveyard, 1 of each of the elemental attributes, fire, water, earth, and wind, and then you gain the effect of being able to shuffle 1 card in the field into the deck. Now, the effect is good. It's basically a Castell in quick play form, but its activation requirement is way too much effort for the effect it has, Banishing 4 monsters of 4 different attributes from your graveyard is not a condition most decks can fulfill out of the box, and you'd have to build a deck specifically to use this card. The monsters featured on the card artwork are the 4 dragon rulers, all elemental dragons who gain effects when banished, and hit the graveyard often, and could fulfill the requirements of this card pretty easily. But even they didn't put this card in their decks when they were in full power. It's just, the activation requirements are just too much for what it does, even in a deck that could fully benefit from its cost, making it one of the most ridiculous activation requirements for a card. Ridiculous in how too ridiculous it is for the minor effect it ultimately has. Number 2, Weather Report. This card is kind of nuts. You see, in order to activate its effect, you need to flip this card face up and destroy Swords of Revealing Lights on your opponent's side of the field. And if you do, you get to perform your next battle phase twice. Getting a double battle phase can win you the duel, so it's a good effect. But it's incredibly difficult to pull off, as you need to destroy a specific spell card on your opponent's side of the field. And unless you know your opponent plays that card, it's almost impossible to actually use this effect, unless you just straight up give your opponent the card through either gift exchange or exchange. But then it relies on whether or not your opponent actually decides to use it. Luckily, Swords of Revealing Light is a good card that you'd want to use no matter the deck you play. So unless your opponent knows you have a set weather report, they'll probably play the card and allow you to gain the effect, which is all incredibly convoluted. This is the only card in this list that literally requires you to give your opponent a specific card that they need to activate on their own free will in order to fulfill the conditions. Although, this is also technically a counter card, made specifically to counter Swords of Revealing Lights, and is not really intended to be forcefully activated, like how I just described. And finally, number 1, the card I think has the most ridiculous activation requirements is Hero Flash. This card has a deceptively simple, yet hard to pull off activation requirement, in that you need to have 4 specific spell cards in your graveyard, this card in hand, and a whole host of normal monsters on the field. Now, I say deceptively simple because how hard can it be to get 4 spell cards in the graveyard, when 2 of them are actually pretty good? Well, actually kinda difficult. If you want to pull off Hero Flash, you have to build your deck around it. Cards like Foolish Burial Goods and Magical Hats can help you get the 4 cards needed in the graveyard, but then you just kinda have to rely on luck to draw Hero Flash itself, since there's no way to search the card out. Which is a big problem because you're spending resources to get these specific spell cards in the graveyard, and if you never actually draw into the card they're there for, you've essentially just wasted cards. But let's assume you got lucky and drew into Hero Flash, and managed to get the 4 cards in the graveyard. Now you need to get a field full of normal monsters. The normal elemental hero monsters are all terrible. Neos is by far the strongest one, and he's a level 7 monster who needs to be cheated out. Neos Alias is the second best choice, as he's treated as a normal monster while on the field, has 1900 attack, and is level 4. Then you have Sparkman at 1600 attack, being the third best normal monster. But the problem is, you have to get these cards out independently of using Hero Flash, and heroes aren't exactly about swarming their normal monsters out, and are all about fusions. So it's really weird that Hero Flash only works on normal monsters, but like, whatever. It's not like they have 0 E-hero specific cards to get out normal monsters. Even one of the cards required to activate Hero Flash, Oh Oversoul, helps with getting Neos out on the field easier, and Hero's Bond can be used to swarm the field with Alias and Sparkmans from hand. But then you have to banish the 4 cards from your graveyard in order to activate its effect, which means you can't just keep using Hero Flashes if you draw into them later on, and have to set up the graveyard for each and every one of them, which would be fine if Hero Flash was an OTK card, like most of the cards in this list, but it's not. It's more often than not just going to allow Neos to attack directly once and that's it. But I guess it is technically possible to OTK with this card. If you manage to bring out a Neos with O Oversoul, and then used Hero's Bond on Neos Alias on the field to special summon 2 more Neos Aliases from your hand. And then you'll have 8,200 points of damage, which is enough for an OTK with a Hero Flash. It's like if Law of the Normal required you to set up the graveyard and the field in order to use its effect, except there's less ways to swarm Elemental Hero normal monsters. And that's why I think it's the most ridiculous activation requirement of a card. It just requires so much setup for such a mediocre effect. But you can technically cheat out the effect of this card with Diamond Dude, who himself is a hero monster, so it kinda combos with it. Kinda. You can't actually attack directly with Hero Flash's effect, just allows you to use it without having to set up your graveyard. Alright, and that's it for the list. This list was a little awkward to put together, as I didn't really order the cards from best to worst, and more about how difficult they were to pull off for the effect they gave. If you have a good suggestion for future videos, or to maybe highlight some hard to pull off effects that I didn't cover in this video, just let me know down in the comments.